This is Kevin, and I welcome you back to the Midnight Mystery Archive. I'm excited because this is our first ever listener Q&A episode. So before we begin, I just want to thank everybody who took time to submit questions for this episode. What stood out for me wasn't just how many questions came in, it was the quality of the questions. There weren't really any demands for answers or what do you think happened, or pressure for conclusions. They were thoughtful, they were process-driven questions about the evidence, the investigation, how the case unfolded, and the way that it did. And that's really what the purpose of this episode is intended to be. So I'm really happy to jump into this. Now, bear in mind, my regular episodes, they're scripted. And this episode is going to be more off the cuff. So you'll probably experience a little bit more personality come through and a lot less of a rigid script style episode. So hopefully you appreciate the departure from the norm as well. But not going to hold it up. We're going to jump right into it, and we'll start with the first question. And that is, which pieces of evidence are most often misunderstood or oversimplified when people discuss the JonBenét Ramsey case? And it's a great question. And this is probably the most important place to start because so much of the certainty surrounding the JonBenet case rests on evidence that's been flattened over time. I think the first example of that is the ransom note itself, and we spent a lot of time on that in this series. The note is often treated as if it carries a single obvious meaning, either it's proof of an intruder or proof of staging. But that's not how experts actually approach documents like this, and we have to remember that. Handwriting analysis, for example, is really a game of probabilities. It's not definitive. Analysts will often look at consistencies and inconsistencies, but not certainty, because they just simply can't. And over time, those nuances, they get lost and they're replaced by simplified conclusions that people now treat as some sort of an established fact. DNA evidence is another area where misunderstanding is common as well. Now, DNA is powerful, but it is not magic. And in this case, the samples that exist, they're limited, they're partial, and they are heavily debated in terms of transfer and contamination. Yet the public discussion often frames the DNA as either a full exoneration or a complete dead end. And neither reflects how forensic science actually works. And then there's the behavior. The interviews, the emotional reactions, and the perceived inconsistencies are often treated as evidence themselves. And behavior can always raise questions in these cases, but it cannot answer them. Trauma distorts memory, it distorts emotion and communication, and after decades, we're often judging appearance instead of actual proof. And what's been lost over time in the JonBenet case is context. When evidence loses context, it becomes symbolic rather than investigative. So that's just kind of my take on that first question. It's a great question. I'll go into question number 2, which is there any single moment in the investigation where you think the case fundamentally changed directions? The simple answer is yes, exclamation point. But obviously that's not a sufficient answer for the question. It's really not a single moment as much as it is a window of time. And it's that first 24 to 48 hours after JonBenet's death. That period of time was critical. Those 24 to 48 hours unfolded inside a home that should have been treated as a controlled crime scene, but it wasn't. We talked about it in one of the early episodes. There were people milling around that home within a couple of hours of Patsy Ramsey making the call. And once that scene was compromised and early assumptions began shaping the investigative focus, the case started down a path that was difficult to correct. And we're almost 30 years later, I would say you can make the argument it never corrected. But in my estimation, the real shift came when the media attention escalated before the investigation had really stabilized. At that point, the case stopped being shaped solely by the evidence and really began being shaped by perception. The investigators weren't just working the case, they were responding to leaks and headlines and public pressure. It had really gotten out of hand by that point. And once institutional positions had hardened and the agencies working the case, whether it was the DA's office or the Boulder Police Department, once they fractured in their approach, clarity became increasingly difficult to restore. So, that's kind of my take on where the case fundamentally changed direction, and I appreciate the question. The third question that I received was, how did conflicting priorities between law enforcement agencies affect the investigation? And to me, this is one of the least sensational but most consequential elements of the case. At its core, the conflict wasn't personal, it was philosophical. The Boulder Police Department approached the case with a traditional homicide mindset: move quickly, narrow suspects, preserve evidence. The DA's office was far more cautious and focused on the prosecutability and the long term viability of the case. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but when those philosophies collide without alignment, investigations stall. It's inevitable. Information sharing becomes selective, and trust erodes, decisions get delayed. Instead of one unified investigative track, the case developed parallel paths, and parallel paths rarely converge cleanly. The fragmentation that resulted and really became the centerpiece of the JonBenét Ramsey investigation never fully recovered. The investigation was hampered as a result of those conflicting priorities. Now, I want to call out several listeners asked variations of the next question, and it's one that comes up repeatedly whenever this case is discussed. So I appreciate everybody who asked a similar question. That is, why do experts disagree so sharply on the ransom note even decades later? And for me to answer that, I really have to come at it from this standpoint. The ransom note sits kind of at an intersection of multiple disciplines. And those disciplines don't all ask the same questions. So you have handwriting analysts examine physical formation. Linguists will focus on language patterns and the use of words. Profilers assess the tone and the authority, and investigators consider access and opportunity. Each of those approaches can produce valid conclusions, but they don't necessarily align. The note itself is also anomalous. It's unusually long, which we've talked about, written inside the home. That's pretty much an established fact. And it blends authority with theatrical language. Those characteristics don't fit standard ransom scenarios, making interpretation far more subjective. And because the other evidence failed to provide clarity early on, the ransom note was really asked to carry way too much explanatory weight. It simply couldn't do it. When one piece of evidence is burdened with answering too many questions, disagreement is really inevitable at that point. So that's a great question about the ransom note. I will make one slight note and offer a personal opinion on the ransom note. I mentioned in the series that at this point, the official standing on the note is that Patsy Ramsey could not be excluded from authoring the ransom note, and that's important. Now, this is a rare case where I'm going to give you my personal opinion. I believe, based on the evidence that exists, that Patsy Ramsey did write that note. Now, I cannot explain why that happened, what the motivation was, what it was intended to do, but I am at the point where I believe Patsy wrote that note. I'll leave that there. We'll move on to the next question. How much weight should behavior actually carry in a criminal investigation? And this is a fantastic question, and I really appreciate this. Behavior is one of the most misunderstood aspects of criminal investigation. Behavior can suggest areas to examine more closely, but it is not evidence of guilt or innocence, and that has to be understood. Humans are wired to read meaning into behavior, especially during emotionally charged events. When someone doesn't react the way that we expect, we interpret that as, oh, that's suspicious. But expectation is not a scientific standard. Trauma disrupts emotional regulation, memory, and communication. Detachment, inconsistency, or emotional flatness, they are not reliable indicators of deception in and of themselves. And in this case, behavior filled gaps that evidence couldn't. And once behavior became central to public belief, nuance disappeared. Behavior should guide questions, not answer them. And I think that's really, really important to note. And one of the best examples of it, and I did not really cover this in any detail in the series, is the Burke Ramsey interview with Dr. Phil. There is a very large group of people who follow the JonBenét Ramsey case and pinpoint that specific interview as the smoking gun that Burke Ramsey had a tantrum that morning and hurt his sister, and she died as a result of it. And I understand how people might come to that conclusion, but I want to offer a contrarian view. Burke Ramsey was 9 years old. In the interview with Dr. Phil, he was an adult. What I saw in that interview was a young man who was probably on the spectrum, socially awkward, maybe not able to properly regulate his emotion or his facial features. And because of that, people jumped to the conclusion that, oh, that little smirk he had, that must mean he knows he got away with it, and other sorts of comments that were made about Burke. I simply don't believe he's responsible for anything. There is not a shred of evidence to support that, and if people are going to pinpoint the Dr. Phil interview as their best evidence, that's a prime example of the question here in question 5. Behavior is so misunderstood, and you cannot simply judge guilt or innocence based off behavior. There is context that is always missing, and Burke's interview is the best example to answer that particular question. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to question number 6. Do you think this case would have unfolded differently without 24-hour media coverage? So that was really we basically had an entire episode on media coverage. And the simple answer for me is yes. And not because I necessarily think the media intended harm, but because scale changes everything. Media attention in this case arrived before evidence stabilized, before narratives were tested, before investigators had room to even make mistakes privately. Once coverage intensified, every leak became amplified, every delay was suspicious, and every decision became public. And that created a feedback loop between the media and investigators and public belief. And would the case have been solved without media coverage? There's no way to know that. But it almost certainly would have unfolded more slowly and more quietly and with a lot less pressure for certainty. In investigations, slowness is often an asset, and it simply didn't exist in the JonBenét Ramsey case. I'll tell you a story. I was in high school when this happened, and it, of course, was 29 years ago. Right now, Christmas break, Christmas vacation. I had a psychology class, and we returned after Christmas break. In the psychology class, we're going to talk about JonBenet because it was the lead story on every news channel. It was front page news on every paper. It was on every tabloid in the supermarket. You could not run away from the JonBenet Ramsey case. When media is so prominent and so central to the story and how that story is being portrayed, when I reflect back on it, I don't think the case could possibly be solved under that scenario. I don't think it was possible. You could have gathered the all-star of history's greatest law enforcement investigative minds. I don't think under those circumstances that this case could have been solved. So do I think it would have turned out differently had the 24-hour media not existed? I don't believe that, but I absolutely believe the circumstances that existed at the time and the amount of attention this case got probably did prevent it from being solved. So those are the 6 questions that I picked out of the dozen or so that I received on the JonBenét Ramsey investigation. I want to thank everybody who submitted questions. I enjoyed reading them. They were not easy questions, but they were careful and they were well thought out, and I really appreciate that. Now remember, this series was never intended to be or ever about choosing sides or forcing conclusions. It's been about understanding how investigations work and where they break down. If there's one takeaway from this case, to me it's this. When answers arrive too quickly, truth often arrives too late or not at all. And I think the JonBenét Ramsey case is the epitome of that. And I'll leave the JonBenét Ramsey case with this one last thought. The best hope, and I fear the only hope of this case being solved, rests in the advancement of DNA technology. Will DNA technology get to the point where the DNA evidence found on JonBenét's clothing can be tested and identify the culprit? That's the best chance this case has of being solved. DNA technology, it's a quick, evolving science, and my hope is that the day will come where there will be definitive answers for JonBenet and that justice can be served. That's my sincere hope. So again, I appreciate everybody's questions. This has been the Part 6 Q&A on the JonBenét Ramsey investigation. Before I leave you, make sure to go to midnightmysteryarchive.com. You can stream episodes there from the homepage. It's a great resource. It's a well laid out website. I'm very happy with it. You can also go to the official Midnight Mystery Archive Facebook group. It's linked in the episode description. Please go there, join the group, join the conversation about the cases that we cover, but also other true crime news. It's making headlines as we speak. And if the series has earned your trust, please consider leaving a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps us reach new listeners who value responsible true crime storytelling, which is what I aim to deliver. Also, one last little hint of a special project I have upcoming. On March 6, 2026, I will be launching a special 12-part series on one of the most famous missing persons cases of the last 50 years. I'm working with the family on this case, and it's something that I'm very excited to share more details about, which I will do after the new year. So just a little something there to wet your whistle. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.